Okay, admit all. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Welcome, welcome.
Hello.
Folks are filing in. Excellent. Let me get all my stuff set up here. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started, I think. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Catherine Hecht, and I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Valley Film Society. So good to have you here with us tonight. We are recording tonight's lecture, so we'll be available for our friends who weren't able to join us. But with us tonight is the inimitable Karen Davis, or Katie Davis, as she is known, a senior film programmer with the Mill Valley Film Festival, and film aficionado, cinephile, francophile, you name it. And she's taught just about everywhere in the Bay Area. So we'll get to talk to her a little bit about that later too. But before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. We're going to start with our land acknowledgement, and then we'll move on to other items. All right. So the Alexander Valley Film Society recognizes that we are on unceded lands of the Coast Miwok, Pomo, and Wapo. We respectfully, excuse me, I'm having problems speaking tonight. We respectfully acknowledge the Indigenous people who have lived here and continue to live here for thousands of years, and who continue to contribute in meaningful ways to their communities and our society as a whole. Our deepest thanks go to Nikki Myers-Lim and the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center, as well as Clint McKay from the Pepperwood Preserve for their assistance with our first acknowledgement. So the next thing to do is to thank our donors and sponsors. I'm going to put a little note here in the chat that thanks to our donors and sponsors, tonight's lecture, as all of the lectures in our Cinema Arts and Lecture series, have been made free to the public. And so if you are so moved and would like to contribute a suggested $10 donation, you can go to our website and do so there. But please don't let money be a deterrent. Come back, see us each time. We have a lineup of speakers throughout the year. And tonight we get to talk about Diva. I hope everybody rewatched. I did last night. Perfect rainy day movie. So without further ado, I think I'm going to turn it over to you, Katie. And I'm here when you need me.
Hello, everyone, and I am thrilled to be here with you at the Alexander Valley Film Society. Some of you, I am shocked, who should have heard me speak way too much. Doug Mueller, I'm shouting at you. Sue Campbell, I'm shouting at you. People I have known among this group for many, many years who should be sick of hearing me talk, whether in the classroom or on stage at Mill Valley, but I am so thrilled that you're all here and that there will be more of you watching the recording. And let's get going. Let's dive into Diva, one of my favorite films. I'd just like to know in the chat, how many of you saw it for the first time, or raise your hand if you saw it for the first time just for this conversation. I don't see any hands. I don't see any digital hands. That means people have seen it before. And so we really will take a deeper dive and we can get into the film that way, because I can't see this film enough. It just warms the cockroaches of my very heart and just perks me up no matter what at any time. So what did I do immediately after the end of a very tiring Mill Valley Film Festival just a couple of days ago? I watched Diva, and what a pleasure in my PJs and the softly falling rain to watch it for the, I don't know how many time. But for the purposes of this lecture, I want to divide things up into a few different sections. I want to give you a little bit of historical background of what happened in French cinema after the New Wave. And then I want to go into the subgenre that Diva fits into, and that this particular director, Jean-Jacques Beineix, pretty much initiated, and that's called Le Cinéma du Look, as in L-O-O-K, the look, Le Cinéma du Look. and a bit of then diving in a little deeper into a bit of a background on the director, Jean-Jacques Beineix of Diva, and then an analysis of the film, followed by our discussion. And peppering the discussion, we've got 3 clips to illustrate things that I think are really emblematic of what makes this film so special. So some point during the discussion, we may pop into the screen and share 3 clips that are each about 2 minutes long, iconic scenes from this film. So yeah, this film made in 1981 is definitely part of post-New Wave French cinema. New Wave, Nouvelle Vague being the style and genre of French cinema that came into being after World War II, primarily among directors who were film critics working for Cahiers du Cinéma, a film magazine that continued for many years and pretty much set the stage for film criticism worldwide. A lot of the film critics from Cahiers du Cinéma decided to make their own genres, their own films, which then begat the French New Wave genre. 2 directors you certainly would have heard of would be François Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard. So there were many others in the French New Wave, but that is not our concern today. Just so you know that what happened after the Nouvelle Vague directors did their thing, French cinema became a lot more commercial, costume dramas, literary adaptations. Even some of the New Wave directors moved in that direction, except for Jean-Luc Godard, always the bad boy, even today in his 80s. He got more and more Marxist, more and more experimental in his filmmaking and did not go commercial. Several trends of the post-Nouvelle Vague, late 60s and 70s that influenced French filmmaking would include some of the exterior circumstances facing France at that time. For instance, a lot of guerrilla independent people's movements in the developing countries that were former French colonies. What was going on politically in those colonies and was making the news, not just in France, but around the world, sparked a lot of directors to address the theme of politics in political thrillers like Costa Gavras's Z, which I hope many of you have seen, or the amazing Gillo Pontecorvo's Battle of Algiers, one of my other favorite films. So you had French productions that addressed guerrilla movements and politics. You also had, in the post-Nouvelle Vague era, a literary arts movement in cultural criticism that was known in this country as postmodernism, which is kind of a way to meld high culture and popular culture that was occurring in the US in the 60s and 70s with artists like Andy Warhol, pop art, and French theorists like Baudrillard, who were fascinated by American cities like Las Vegas in particular that mixed high and low arts, high and low culture, entertainment, and crass commercialism. So keep that in mind, as well as the kind of political thriller influence when we're starting to look at what influences shaped Beineix in his script for Diva. And then also in the late 1970s came a very anarchistic and nihilistic influence, which we know as punk rock. And that started in the US, by the way, contrary to popular notions that it began with the Sex Pistols in England. It began with groups like the Ramones, the New York Dolls, even before then. And then moving over to the UK with the Sex Pistols, and in Paris, the punk influence of groups and individuals, one of which comes to mind right off the bat is Plastic Bertrand, whose big hit in the late 70s was Ça plane pour moi, if you're curious. So yeah, a lot of cultural influences made it into Diva, and we will break some of those down, but particularly the postmodernist look and the feel of what we now call retrofuturism, let's say, seeped into international filmmaking, not just in Diva, but also the Mad Max franchise, beginning in 1979, George Miller's great, franchise, Blade Runner in 1981, the same year as Diva, another great example of postmodern retrofuturism. Think for a minute of the production design of Blade Runner. Think for a minute of the crazy action retrofuturist madcap adventures of Mad Max. And then you're beginning to sort of see how Diva might fit into that moment in filmmaking. So French films produced in the late 70s and early 80s, something known as the polar, the postmodern thriller, which borrowed influences from American film noir and the French New Wave, with a certain recycled pastiche styling set in an imaginary futuristic dystopic world, not unlike, say, Blade Runner or Mad Max, but in a very French style. So another trend in film production throughout the relatively new, what was then and is now the European Union, of which France was a major part, was the beginnings of international co-productions in film with actors, directors, and financing from several countries within one film. So a kind of a globalized cinema in a more globalized world replaced the notion of national cinema that would produce films that were strictly about French subjects produced in France, but made for French audiences and international audiences. The same with, let's say, classic Swedish films from Ingmar Bergman, the notion of auteurist and director cinema that comes specifically from several countries. Instead, we've got a lot of international financing to put together one film in a more globalized setting using actors, let's say from Italy or Germany, in one co-financed French film production, or a German co-production that's a combination of French, Italian, Swiss, and Swedish elements. This is the postmodern world of Diva that's in the background of how such a film would get produced from corporations that contributed money from different nations that had an easier time moving capital across borders with an EU fully online, let's say. So the look and feel of something more international and a more international production is also something to think about when we look at French cinema from the 80s, particularly films like Diva, stories and characters from different cultures coming together in one film production. So with all of these various influences and trends filtering into cinema, the 1980s produced a new but short-lived, I'll say, style, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, called le cinéma du look, primarily evident in the films of three French film directors, Luc Besson, which many of you know his work because he moved to Hollywood and began to make action films, very popular in the US. Léos Carax, quite the opposite. He remained in France and remains in France, kind of a recluse, doing really out there avant-garde films that are often spaced apart by decades, but he was also very influential in Le Cinéma du Look, and Jean-Jacques Beineix, the director of Diva. So, Le Cinéma du Look. I'm taking this from a bi-monthly film magazine produced in the UK that comes out online called Little White Lies, and I found it really informative if you want to inform yourself a little bit more on this subgenre of French filmmaking from the 80s. So Le Cinéma du Look goes approximately from 1981, Diva being perhaps the first and best known film from this subgenre, up until the early 90s. And only 10 films are said to be produced within Le Cinéma du Look by these three directors, Beineix, Carax, and Besson. And what are these films? What defines them? What unites them? They are, frankly, obsessed with visual design, production design, and also obsessed with pop cultural influences, some of which I mentioned in the last section. So what signifies these films might include non-naturalistic color palettes, really calling attention to things. The visual designs that call attention to reflective surfaces and spaces, innovative lighting design, as I mentioned. And as far as themes go, these films focus often on disenfranchised youth, young people. For instance, not just the character of Jules in Beineix, but even more so, Beineix's next film, or his third film after Diva, was Betty Blue. That definitely fits this bill. La Femme Nikita, Luc Besson's first film, that fits this bill as well. You know, off-kilter lovers on the run, for instance. So yeah, what influenced these three filmmakers of Le Cinéma du Look were filmmakers from the past, including the new Hollywood films of the 1970s. For instance, Francis Ford Coppola's Rumblefish, think of that film, or One from the Heart, or maybe it occurred to you while watching this film, Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde, or maybe you thought of television commercials, or maybe you thought of MTV, or maybe you thought of fashion photography. All of these would be good guesses about what influenced Carax, Beineix, and Besson in these seminal films with Le Cinéma du Look. There's a stylistic playfulness. I mentioned the strong color washes, the calling attention to the production design and the sets. Genre influences, thrillers, sci-fi, action movies, road movies, references to other films and to television and to advertising for a kind of postmodern pomo pastiche feel that blends highbrow cultural influences, like in Diva, the opera, and lowbrow as well, popular culture. So Le Cinéma du Look disappeared just about as quickly as it appeared. The three directors moved on with their filmmaking. Besson, as most of us know, moved to Hollywood and began to do high-octane action films. Carax, as I mentioned, his highly avant-garde experimentalism. And Beineix, after trying a couple more fiction features, pursued his first love, which was science. He studied medicine, actually, before he went into filmmaking. And he began to do documentaries for French TV that never made it internationally, basically. But Le Cinéma du Look left a pretty big influence on French cinema. If you are familiar with the work of Jean-Pierre Jeunet, the guy who did with his partner, Caro, Delicatessen, City of Lost Children, for instance, Amélie, another one of his films, or the much more really intense filmmaker of the 1990s who's still working today on very edgy films in France, Gaspard Noé. Some of his films are I Stand Alone, Climax, Vortex, Lux Eterna, for the French cinema nerds. So yeah, he left an influence, not just Beineix, but Le Cinéma du Look left its influence on future French filmmakers and perhaps some international filmmakers that might have struck you that I haven't mentioned. And I'm curious to hear from you when we get to the conversation part of things. Beineix, very briefly, born in 1946. I mentioned he studied science, particularly medicine, but then he got sidetracked, like many of us do, and became an assistant to the director Claude Berry, who did the famous international successes, Jean de Florette, Manon of the Spring. Anyway, so he learned the traditional styles of directing from some of the greats of the 1960s and 70s before beginning his directing career with Diva. He directed just a few short films and plunged into his first feature, incredibly successful, but took a long time to hit its plateau, and that would be Diva. His second feature was Moon in the Gutter, which kind of went into the gutter. It got a few nods by the Cannes Film Festival, but didn't do much business at the box office. And his third feature in 1986 was Betty Blue, which made its lead actress, Béatrice Dalle, an international superstar. It was a huge international success. It earned Best International Film and Golden Globe nominations and made a lot of people pay attention to Diva. And so Diva got a second wind and became kind of iconic at that point. So I mentioned he's still alive now, or maybe I didn't mention it, and most of his productions are small budgets for French TV, doing science and nature documentaries. So that's where he is now. Okay, now digging into the film itself. We can call Diva a postmodernist police thriller, known in France as a polar, polar, kind of a nihilistic punk humor and a pastiche approach to its amazing production design, using the recycled warehouse decors, the reflective glass, sunglasses, reflections in mirror sunglasses, kind of a high art, that is opera meets pop culture sensibility with a hefty dose of new age Zen spirituality tossed into the mix, very reflective of the times. So the plot line, I keep mentioning postmodernism, but the plot line really is quintessentially postmodern, with a cast of characters obsessed by the distinction between authenticity, like the original live performance, and recording, the copy, and the value of a copy. Let's just put that aside for now. The film borrows, in the true spirit of postmodernism, borrowing comes up a lot, from another, from a number of styles: French New Wave, American film noir, multiculturalism. And multiculturalism enters into this film. Everybody's name is Gorodish, or La Antillaise, one of the other crime bosses, Saporta. Everybody is from sort of somewhere else in a way. Alba, who's referred to as the Vietnamese Viet Cong in a loving way by Gorodish, her partner in crime and lover. The United States is echoed in this film in many places, particularly in the form of the diva herself. The fact of a world being a multicultural world, and that opera is being represented by a Black American opera star, Wilhelmenia Fernandez Wiggins, is right there a pastiche in the form of a supremely gifted African-American opera diva. So the film is quite a unique blend of artistic endeavor and commercial mainstream thriller, with a great dose of Black humor thrown in there as well. I think I dropped a hint that despite all of this appeal, it bombed at the French box office, and only later did it get to be a big hit in the US, and then its popularity was rediscovered in France, and it eventually won 4 Césars awards, their equivalent of the Academy Award. The film is not a purely original script. It's an adaptation of a 1979 novel by a Swiss writer and Zen practitioner named Danielle Audier, whose novel is also called Diva, and which was adapted for screen by Beineix. So yeah, the original versus the copy, that is the basis of postmodernism in the 80s. And that is the basis of Diva. the diva herself, who will not let herself be recorded, and the value of the copy, the one copy that Jules makes for his own pleasure that everybody wants their hands on. Other things echo this tension between something original and something copied. When Jules steals the diva's gown and all of Paris becomes obsessed with this crime, he's so in love with her that he's looking for a copy and goes to Saint-Denis, Rue Saint-Denis, where the sex workers are, and takes the gown with him. And that's a substitute that's not a substitute for the real thing, but for at least one night, his desire is satiated by a kind-hearted, classically kind-hearted lady of the night who is agreeable to wear the diva's gown for Jules. So yeah, the original and the copy. I mentioned the references to France's colonial wars, particularly to their presence in Vietnam before it became the US's problem. It was France's war. And in the form of Alba, the memorable, wonderful character of the young girl and accomplice to Gorodish, she herself is a master spy. She herself is referred to as a Vietnamese thief. We first meet her in a record store where she is stealing, actually it's a Chick Corea record to bring back to Gorodish. So yeah, France's colonial presence in countries like Vietnam is referenced in this film through a central character such as Alba herself. The opera itself, the Paris Opera, appears as the ultimate high meets low symbol in this movie. It appears on Alba's skirt, and I'm going to drop out of the frame for a second and come back and show you that skirt. It is mine. I have it, and I didn't steal it. Alba has one, and I bought the other. I wish I had stolen it. It would have been true to form, but yes. So the opera appearing on Alba's skirt as a copy of itself is in itself a mélange of past and present. The opera music within the film, the aria that Cynthia Wiggins sings from the opera La Wally by Alfredo Catalani, is in itself the story of an outsider. And we can see that outsider within the movie as Jules, the young postman, who must leave his home, as Jules must, and is alone in the world, unable to return. And as we know, one of the central tensions in the film is that Jules's life is in danger if he returns home. So, yeah, that's sort of a 30-minute mashup of influences in Diva. So to start our discussion, oh, by the way, yes, you may be wondering, how the heck did KD get this skirt? The skirt made it from Paris to Los Angeles on Melrose Street, where I was wandering the thrift stores and wandered in when I heard the sounds of French being spoken. And I had just moved back from Paris to start work at Mill Valley Film Festival, and wandered down Melrose into this store, which doesn't exist anymore, called Cowboys and Poodles. And it turns out that that store is owned by the costumier, the costume designer of Diva, of the film. And I started chatting that I just moved back and was working in Paris in film, and moved back to San Francisco to work for a film festival, and the subject of Diva came up, and the owner came out with something that he said I must have, and he would be happy to sell it to me wholesale. And he produced the skirt, and my jaw dropped, and I went, you have got to be kidding. That's Alba's skirt. I can't buy Alba's skirt. He said, just like the movie, there are realities and there are copies. This is a copy. I made 2 of them. You can have, she has one and you can have the other. So for $40, there it is. So that's the story. Okay, let's start speaking of, well, let's see. Catherine's going to be our driver here of these 3 clips. I'd like to start with the incredible police chase, just to get the blood going. Let's start with the impossible chase through the Paris metro, which clocks in at around 3 minutes and 45 seconds. And hopefully the quality of the clip is good. So Catherine, if you're ready, let's just do that impossible chase with the moped through the Paris metro and the arcades. It's incredible. Are we ready? Okay, are we back? I think we should just roll through maybe, well, unless people want to talk about that clip, the poor Malaguti, that he has promised not to destroy, is destroyed. But I bring that one up because it is an iconic scene. It's just amazing how they shot that. Any comments on that scene, on that clip?
Katie, I did have a question. I'm curious, do you know how they filmed going down the stairs next to him?
Oh my God, I wish I knew. I was looking and looking. So I am going to toss this into my more production-oriented, the people I know. Okay, Doug Mueller, I'm looking at you. Doug, how the heck did they do that? And Dan, I'm not calling on you yet. I know, I could, but Doug, how could they have done that? What's holding that thing up? And what speed are they filming it? Because this is filmed in film. Come in, Doug Mueller. All right. If Doug so chooses not to speak, I really would guess that it was shot at a totally different frame rate back in the days when we had frames. I would guess that through an optical effect, because this is pre-digital, that they had to blue screen, because there was no green screen, out the cables that were holding the Malaguti from tumbling down the stairs. I do not believe that they could have blue screened in the Malaguti going down some artificial stairs against a backdrop of the real metro. That I don't believe was possible at the time. So I'm going to say that what they did do was paint out the cables that are holding this thing from going out of control and filming at a different frame rate. That would just be my guess. Any other possibilities from the more production-oriented people here?
Hi, Karen. I think you're on the right track. I was definitely, there's a frame rate thing going on there through the whole scene. And, you know, part of that is it's as we're watching it over Zoom, it's a little bit increased, right? But I think that you're on to the right track with that. That makes sense.
Ladies and germs, Professor Dan Janos.
I'm sorry, I was late, teacher.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that later, okay? Okay, so yeah, frame rates. Back in the day when there were such thing as film frames, if you shoot at a higher frame rate, once it is projected and comes out in the final cut, it's going to, so you shoot at a higher frame rate to get something to slow down to something that looks more like the pace that thing would be tumbling down the stairs. I think they also had to paint out frame by frame in some manner or means the cables that are holding that back that are just out of frame. Anything else about that clip before we go to, so this.
I just have one question about the clip.
Yeah.
So on the subway, the older guy shows his card. What does his card say? What's the gag?
It says he's a veteran combatant. It says that he's a World War II veteran on a pension. So when the police says, I'm the police, this guy says, oh yeah, you think you're a big tough guy? Well, I fought in World War II, you punk. I'm not leaving my seat. He's got the preferential seating.
That's excellent.
And he's showing his World War II combatant to show this policier that who's the badass, you or me? He thinks that the police is trying to play badass and get a free ride. Well, this veteran of World War II has fought for his seat, and he's not about to get up out of that seat for some young punk policeman.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a bit of humor there, bit of French humor. So this scene I chose because it is emblematic of the action, the policier. This is a thriller. It's in the subgenre of policier action, and it does it so well. Let's go to the Zen and the Art of Buttering the Baguette clip, if that's okay, Catherine. Clip 3. Okay, this cracks me up every time. There is no bread. There is no butter. You know, it starts out, whoops. So it begins with Richard Bohringer as Gorodish, the Gaulois addicted Zen detective who's got his snorkel on for cutting onions, which, by the way, note to self, I may have to try sometime. And then he brings the postman in to show the Zen and the Art of the Baguette, you know, the bread, the knife, the butter, everything must be perfect, the perfect gesture, which repeats itself until there is no more butter, there is no more bread, there is only everything and nothing. It's like, what? It's makes me smile and laugh every time. It's just the wisdom, as Doug says, it's the Zen and the wisdom, but not mine, the wisdom of buttering the bread, buttering the tartine. Comments on that scene?
Maybe I noticed in this scene, also in the opening scene of the film, we're hearing soundtrack that then cuts out in the playing device in the scene.
Catherine gets an A+, I have to say, because this film does something else playful, and it's present in this clip, which is the play between diegetic and extra-diegetic sound. So students, class, diegetic sound is sound that is motivated from what you see on screen or what we know is off screen, but is there. Let's say a radio that you see that is playing radio music, that is diegetic sound. Or if you happen to know that there's a radio off screen somewhere, then that's still diegetic sound because it's linked to a prop, a sound generating something that is somewhere in the frame or nearby. In this case, we hear the full sound of the space music that seems to be soundtrack, but is actually coming from the turntable that Alba walks over and then lifts it up at the same moment that soundtrack cuts. That's how the film begins too, by the way. The very beginning sounds are Jules. We hear the swelling orchestra of the overture to the opera as we see the postman, Jules, pull up. And then suddenly the sound stops with a click because it's actually, we see it's going from extra diegetic soundtrack. We think it's the soundtrack. And then suddenly we hear it click and we see him turn off his ignition, and it's supposed to be coming from the moped, as if that would produce that kind of sound. But it's a very playful way that you don't see in too many movies. You certainly see it in a film like There's Something About Mary by the Farrelly brothers, for instance, where Jonathan Richman wafts into the frame just when you think there's a soundtrack. Actually, he gets shot and he dies when he appears where he shouldn't be, in the frame of There's Something About Mary. So this movie does that too. And not too many do that, when the sound that you think is orchestral and extra diegetic suddenly enters the frame, cuts off abruptly, and turns out to be motivated when you think it's just the soundtrack. So yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that. I brought this clip in because it represents one of the other classically 80s through lines of this film, and that is New Age wisdom and Zen, which is played with a light touch and a sense of humor, as you could see from Richard Bohringer, the actor's, scuba mask and his endless jigsaw puzzle, and sitting cross-legged in full lotus position or half lotus position on the floor, solving crimes while smoking endless gauloises as Alba roller skates by in his warehouse. So yeah, the kind of spirituality that he also exhibits, because he's actually not just a criminal mastermind, but he is someone who solves crimes by annihilating the opponent in the softest but most deadly way. One way, we see him knock out two of the baddies. One of them is, just as Jules is bloodied and about to be ice picked by Prêtre, Curie is his name, the shaved head guy who's listening to accordion music in his ear, which we only find out when he's dead. But when he's about to kill Jules, Gorodesh appears with a little aerosol spray and sprays it in front of Curie's nose, and he's instantly out like a light. And that enables Jules to be rescued and taken to the lighthouse magic castle, shall we say, by the Normandy shore. The other time is when Gorodesh, the Zen master crime solver, actually ends up killing Saporta. And how does he do it? Who remembers? How does he do it? In his mastermind Zen way? Very effective with a simple gesture at the very end. Who remembers? Speak up.
Didn't he move the light switch?
Yes, by a couple of inches, he pulls the light switch just a few inches back, and Saporta takes that one last step and flop on top of Curie, who also plunged to his death. And that's when we see what was in his ear all the time was this French accordion music. And French accordion music shows up again in this film in a clip that I did not find online, but it's really short and it's one of the funniest clips. It's when the classic French accordion spare change collecting blind guy happens to be plying his trade outside of Gorodish's city dwelling, when the Taiwanese bootleggers come to try to make a deal with him to get that tape off of his hands, and he says, nothing doing. So who can remember that clip, and where the French culture classically represented by an accordion player, a blind accordion player with a little dog. Who remembers that one? What happens there? I can fill in the blank. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. There's a wad of cash, and Gorodish says, no, I will not sell you this bootlegged reel to reel. Throws the cash out, lands in front of the blind accordionist. The dog grabs the cash, and suddenly the accordionist is no longer blind, grabs the cash and says, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. He knows exactly what it is. Not only is his sight healed, but he then wanders off playing the accordion at twice the speed with a very happy, jaunty look, and makes off with the cash. So yeah, just a little accordion aside for those accordion French lovers. Let's go to the third clip, which is the clip that best perhaps represents this film in its very, very romantic theme. So what's happening there in the classic scene that is most perhaps memorable for many of this film? What is the director showing us in this story without any words of dialogue?
I'll take a shot. I think that there's a lot to do with closeness and distance, and they're far apart. He moves closer. She is accepting. We get a couple shots of them as one, and we end up with them far apart again. And it's all suggestive. There's nothing definitive about what this relationship means and where it's going. He's getting closer to the person who he's been desiring since the first scene in the film. And yet when we end up on a close-up of him, he's still somewhere else. Like there's not a look of satisfaction or a look of disappointment. There's just a very sort of blank look of introspection, maybe. And I love how carefully it's framed. Every shot, it's not just a, hey, they got together montage. It's really beautiful and lovely, and all the camera moves sort of bring our attention to them, and then it'll tilt up and our attention goes away from them, and then we come back to them. So it really builds dramatically, but I think it all revolves around, he gets closer, but maybe she's not reachable. Maybe that's part of being the diva, that she is still going to be under that umbrella by herself at the end of the day.
Beautifully said, Professor Janos. Who else got something from that scene?
I was struck by it seems like they're the only two people on the planet. And all of the, there's man-made wonder, but it reminds me of, I couldn't pinpoint it, but some, late 70s, early 80s films using New York as a backdrop, where it's so sparsely populated. And in this case, there were no other humans, there were cars, but this kind of dreamlike movement through structures and parks, and being completely alone together. And I like what Dan just said too, alone together and almost alone from each other. The dreaminess was in each of them individually as well.
That's also really beautifully expressed. Yeah. like they are the only two living souls in Paris, with the statues that represent the past and history and tradition. And yet these lovers who are not lovers, but are coming together in the only way perhaps that they will ever or can ever come together. It's a beautiful sequence that when the camera pans up after Jules does it, there's, I think, 3 shots where he progressively gets closer to his beloved. And just when he touches her and she receives that touch, looks at him a bit pensively, but receives his hand on her shoulder. And then the camera pans up, and then it pans across her sleeping body and her sheet and to the pillow where we're just about to see, and we want to see Jules, and he's not there, but the camera movement continues with an identical sheet, but it's draped across the divan where Jules, fully clothed, has spent the night, because of course he's the fan and the one who's completely bedazzled by the diva, but the diva is the diva, as Dan said. You know, she's there is no equal to her. That's a little bit mirrored, but it's actually, that whole gesture is concluded at the very end of the film, where there's more of an equivalence between the two of them. Does anybody remember the very, very last shots of the film when Jules brings Cynthia into the opera, the empty opera, to listen, to make her listen to the copy and listen to herself for the very first time recorded, and to see what beauty her voice has for others in a way that she's never heard before. Do you remember how their bodies are positioned and what happens over the credits before there's a freeze frame and the rest of the credits roll out? It's an overhead shot from the nosebleed seats, or some crane in the back of the opera. Well, I'll tell you. That's what I'm here for. Well, actually, let's go back a few shots where Jules appears, where you hear Cynthia Hawkins alone in real life on the stage doing her scales before she's going to leave Paris behind, just to see the opera one more, the space one more time before she goes to her next engagement, I guess, is presumed. And then Jules appears from the wings. Well, actually in the orchestra pit, he appears, and now I might be forgetting a couple of details. Then he joins her on stage, and she knows what's about to happen. She says, but I've never heard myself. I've never heard myself sing. And he says, well, you hear the sound of applause. After her scales, you hear the sound of applause. She knows that there's a tape playing because there's no one in the theater. The seats are covered with plastic. There's simply nobody there to applaud, but you hear massive applause and then silence. And Jules, she says, I've never heard myself sing. And Jules says, but listen. And that's when the orchestra begins, and you hear her sing on his tape, his bootlegged, his, you know, whatever, pilfered or bootlegged, whatever you want to call it, tape. And she's listening, and he joins her on stage. And then we get the high shot as the credits are rolling, and the two of them are eye to eye coming together on the stage. He leans into her shoulder. She does not step back, and their faces are so close that a kiss is implied, but not really stated. And that's where there's a freeze frame. You do not see lips meet, but they're close enough at that point. They're on an equal level. And that has meaning, not just to imply that maybe there's a love relationship that can happen, even though we think probably not. What has happened is that the diva has seen the value of recording her voice and how her voice can move an audience as it moved Jules, how it can inspire love in someone as it has inspired that undying, platonic, endless love in Jules. She hears for herself what the power of her voice is. And one has the feeling that maybe she will let herself be recorded so that other people can get the pleasure of her voice the way she's never heard it and the way others have always heard it, only if they're there in the same room. So it's kind of the triumph of the copy over the original in a way. But that's postmodernism, is that the copy is as valuable as the original. And even the diva, the last woman standing, has seen that there is beauty and meaning and power in something that is recorded or copied. It can move, just like her voice. So yeah, there's that. So now let's open up the discussion for the last part to just whatever occurred to you about the film, not guided by these clips I've shown or any of my blah, blah, blah. Your thoughts and impressions of the film when you viewed it this time. Things you noticed you hadn't noticed before, questions you had.
Hi, this is Donna. This is my favorite movie of all time. And when I saw that you were going to be doing this tonight, you know, I thought I was the only person on earth who would be so excited to just hear it talked about in this way. So thank you very much. Going back to the bread scene, it to me, it's prescient of the self sort of egotistical chefs who wax on about the perfect food in front of them. It was very ahead of its time in terms of famous chefs on TV or, you know, whatever, famous chefs talking about food in this way. I thought that was, and it's one of my favorite scenes ever in a movie. And I will say, watching it, I've watched it a couple times during COVID because I love it and I just, whatever. And it is funny just how dated and sexist and I don't know, it's politically incorrect. So much of it is, but that's a slice of time, you know, that makes it so interesting and wonderful. And just the age difference between Alba and the gentleman whose name I can never pronounce is just really kind of disturbing, but but anyway, I still love the film. I just think it was the first movie I ever saw with subtitles and it changed my world. And I saw it actually in a French class in college that they were showing it with subtitles for their French class. And I went along with a friend, blew my mind, you know, whatever. So thank you. I just want to say thank you because I'm just enjoying spending an hour and a half thinking and talking and listening to nothing but Diva. So thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I have in mind also that it didn't hold the test of time with the political correctness, but actually, in many ways, I think it does. I mean, even if the gender roles are, you know, she's the classic feminine, capricious diva in a way, and he's the love-struck boy, I'm not sure where it goes off the rails in that sense of, it is certainly a product of its time, that's for sure. But I do think it's a movie for the ages, and particularly a rainy day, and I just love spending time with it, and it did not make me wince one bit, actually, but that might be just me. There's a comment in the chat from Doug that I hope he doesn't mind that I'm citing him, that he felt that it's validating to see the value of the copy artistically, because our temptation is to, rip or copy the things we like. Well, think about mixtapes. How many relationships, and I can think of many, people I loved or people who loved me, the gesture of love was completely ripping from favorite tunes and putting them all on one little 1/4-inch cassette tape and then handing it to the beloved. The mixtape I give to you, my beloved, without that ever being stated. Being the recipient of a mixtape was like the big gift of love that I would give to someone I loved and would get from those that might want to get a message through, to me perhaps. And that's all about copying and illegal copying, but it's the music, it's more than, the value of the copy. It resonates very deeply. And at the end of this movie, even the diva herself sees the power of her voice. Then again, there are the Taiwanese who just want to profit from her. So there's definitely an implication that those who are copying, those who do it for love, like Jules, and those who do it just for profit, like the Taiwanese who don't have to obey international copyright and who Gorodish dispenses, and the film dispenses with one big bad boom in the white Citroën, that is that beautiful car that he happens to have several of, one of which gets blown up by Saporta, and in it are the 2 bootleggers. So yeah, I guess the filmmaker then next is telling us what he thinks of crass profit off of just copying someone's work for profit. If you're doing it for love, yeah.
Yeah, Katie, I was struck by that. I mean, I am learning so much from this chat and so much about the postmodern, the copy. I mean, that's really fascinating stuff. And I kind of feel like what's happening in this film is a commentary that art is transformative and is meant to be shared and meant to be copied and distributed to one another to communicate and articulate ourselves, our feelings. And yet, as soon as it becomes a commodity, it becomes denaturalized and gross and inappropriate. I mean, that's what we get from the Taiwanese businessmen. And so I there's one other thing I want to point out though about that. After the love stroll scene and she practices in front of him, she does stop midway while she's playing and says, "What's wrong?" And she had just told him that, or she had said to her agent manager, I have to perform with an audience because the audience tells me, we perform together. And then she does have there's part of me that as I'm watching thinking, oh, she's being too rigid, this and that, but then she has that really vulnerable moment where clearly she is incredibly gifted and talented and in tune with her audience. That yes, she stopped what she was reading him like a book while she was performing. So anyway, so that struck me, but though I wanted to get a question in quickly. Can you talk about the cars in his flat?
Yeah. Okay. So his flat is completely postmodern. It is absolutely the essence of postmodernism, drawing from 1950s exaggerations of James Dean, pop art, Roy Lichtenstein, cartoons, op art, pop art, American culture, big muscle cars. The fact that he lives in the back of a chop shop, or if it's not a chop shop, it's a garage where there are, wrecked cars. It's one of the many, many references to American film culture that make this a quintessentially postmodern film from the 80s. So yeah, big cars, it reflects off that moment where Marilyn Monroe, by the way, in Some Like It Hot, there's a copy of Marilyn Monroe crossing a heating grate where the skirt blows up, and that is very sexist. I will totally agree with Donna there. And we see her undies, and it's a quotation straight from Hollywood. And so are the cars, and so is the decor of his jumbled warehouse loft with all kinds of pop culture references. So this is the low art, where high art meets low art. This is the low art part of things. The high art part of things is opera and statues and the Garden of the Tuileries and the Eiffel Tower in the background, the classic French art and architecture of the past that is equally referenced, as is Jules and popular culture. Jules is a perfect postmodern character himself. When we meet him, when Cynthia Hawkins meets him and says, Jules, by the way, Jules is a name that is coming back into vogue. My ex-hubby has his oldest son named Jules. It's a name for a grandfather. It's a grandfatherly name. Even in France, it was totally out of fashion for a couple of generations, and you would not be likely to meet a young man named Jules. And when Cynthia Hawkins asks Le Postier, what is your name? And he says, Jules, she says, I would not expect that name in a young person. And she says, it's so not a young person's name. And yet, in the fact that she recognizes an old soul who loves opera and other outdated things, she says, it suits you perfectly well. Doesn't suit you at all as a young man, but it suits you perfectly well. So young and old embodies is what Jules is the embodiment of. His space in the back of a garage, the decor of that space filled with recording technology, recordings, copies, American culture, that very sexist, it's true, naked, big bazoomed blonde that Alba jumps on top of like it was a hopscotch board and says, reminds me of Raquel Welch. She says, oh, Raquel. I'm seeing stuff in the chat about a death of Jackson Pollock, a crashed car. Yeah, this is the detritus of American culture turned into art, turned into art. So that's what I make of the garage and all of the industrial parking garages and industrial, that's the low culture part of things. That's offset by all of the high culture music. So I don't think that's a very developed answer, but that's all I got at the moment. I'm gonna go to the chat where I see Dan is wondering a little bit about the connection between Beineix, the director, and music. I do not know that he had any musical training or what his passion was for music. One would think he was passionate about opera, but I have not read that in any of what I've read about Beineix. I did not read that he's got a particular affinity for opera. I will say that the music, the sound designer Vladimir Kosma, who made his name with this film and went on to do a lot of soundtracks, mostly for French films, just like the actors, did not do much outside of French cinema, and not even big roles, with the exception of Richard Bohringer, by the way. I'll get to him in a minute. But about the connection of the director to music in general, because music is such a profound theme of this film, opera in particular. Lost my train there. Oh yes, Vladimir Kosma, the sound designer, crafted a lot of music that is most reminiscent of Erik Satie, and I'm not the first to notice it. You probably all noticed it. That scene, the French impressionist styling of the walk through the rain with the umbrella, which is very echoing the visual design of French Impressionism. And was referred to as the only two people in the world walking through the rain. That soundtrack, as it appears, that theme as it appears several times in the movie, da 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 dum dum, da 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 dum dum, very like an etude from Satie, is it, n'est-ce pas? And very deliberately so, without being a copy. It's reflective, but it is, again, sort of a copy thing. So yeah, what did these actors go on to do? The only one that really had a solid career, but his career was established before this film, was Richard Bohringer. He starred in The Cook, the Wife, the Thief, the Lover, the Peter Greenaway classic film. He got a main starring role in that, but has mainly been in French productions. Frédéric Andréi, who plays Jules, really never did much of the order of this role. Alba as well. All of the main characters were really actors who did some work in French cinema, but did not go on to international success, with the possible exception of Richard Bohringer. That's all I'll say about that. Other comments and questions with the little bit of time we have left?
I just wanted to chime in about the music, that there's a lot of bravery, maybe, or just scenes that are allowed to float on the music, and we have these big gaps without dialogue. So even though there's this intrigue in this story about this underworld and the police and all this, there's this great contrast with these scenes that are just musical, and we're just floating with this music. Whether it is the opera singing or the piano pieces that you're talking about with the walking through the park scene. And the film even begins that way, where we're just sort of immersed in the experience of listening to music. And I think that's great. Like, I love that was where we started, because then as these new characters come in and as these pieces of the puzzle start to get put out on the table, there's not really this incredibly strong through line that is handed to you. You know, you really are just wondering, like, well, how does this person relate? And how does this person relate? And why are we in a record store? We're in a record store because it's about music, but then there's this person stealing records. And, you know, so there's a great, I don't know, I liked how loose it started, but it was held together through music. And I really enjoyed that part. And then Satie, there's a gag about Satie in there somewhere, isn't there? Isn't there some line where the diva says something about, they're comparing an opera piece, and she says something like,
Ooh.
I can't, maybe so. Catherine seems to be remembering.
Yeah, Catherine, what do you remember about that?
I don't remember exactly what it was, but she is flippant about Satie, and like with a negative connotation.
That's the perfect word. She's totally flippant. Like, again, it's the low art, high art thing of just sort of like, Satie, whatever.
Yeah, he's popular culture. He's popular classical culture. Yeah.
I think what she said was she used the line as insubstantial as a piece by Satie.
Ouch.
Wow.
Uh-huh.
I wouldn't like to hear that.
No. Yeah, good catch. Good catch. And it is true that all of these different elements, you know, the one that we remember the most are the ones that are of this film are the ones, or we, I'm speaking for myself, are the ones that are threaded together with music. Sure, the punk rock type of, you know, bad guy, you know, the prostitution, drug ring, you know, the policier element of things, that really is almost incidental to the real heart and soul of the movie, which is all about music and the value of the original versus the copy. Yeah, those elements are dropped in and out, and they add to the narrative drive and keep it moving as a film. But its classic sort of timelessness is exactly the floatiness that I think Dan is talking about, where the movie begins and also where it ends. It ends in that same operatic space. Last comments?
Hey, Dee, would you talk a little bit about your teaching in the Bay Area for our young or student of life people who will be watching this after tonight?
Well, I would be delighted to do that. It is too bad, and I apologize on behalf of Dan Janos, who is at Cal State Sacramento, one of the few places I've never taught, although I did do a guest lecture or two there. He could speak because he's still actively teaching, and I am no longer actively teaching except for lectures like this, and I teach through the OLLI, Osher Learning Institute, which always has wonderful film selections. And shameless plug, I'm starting a month-long series on Agnes Varda. So French cinema, yes, it's my thing, and I'll be doing an Osher Institute thing, and maybe future lectures at the Alexander Valley if you're interested in anything that works. As far as people that want to go to film schools, younger people, my home base, as was Dan Janos's home base for many years, academically, was Cal State University, Monterey Bay, of which Doug Mueller is a graduate. So Doug, you mind if I ask you if you, well, I know you would speak to being one of the first few graduating classes, so maybe you can't comment on what things are like at Cal State Monterey now, but you want to say a couple things about CSUMB, because I thought it was a pretty great place. You want to unmute, Doug? I will say, while Doug is deciding whether or not to join us in speaking, is that one of the advantages having a smaller school is more access to equipment. CSU Sacramento, where Dan Janos is, Cal State Monterey Bay, where I was and Dan was for a number of years, you get a lot of professorial one-to-one attention and a lot of time on the equipment to do your own thing. So you can go to all the ratings, you know, and all the places where film schools are rated and decide you want to go to NYU, but you're spending so much money there. And I don't know what class size is, but student teacher ratio is super important for a film department. So I think for bang for your buck, the Cal State universities, many of them, well, Northridge is very big. They have a very big film program, but it's very, very big. But you got Sac State with Dan. You got Cal State Monterey Bay, where I was and where Doug graduated and where Dan used to be. Some of the smaller CSUs. Now, Sonoma State has a lot of film studies classes, not too much of a film production department, unless I'm missing something, because I filled in for the chair of the art department teaching the film curriculum there for a few semesters at Sonoma State. But for people wanting film production, what I will say, no offense to my colleagues who are phenomenal teachers at some of the private schools, because I just know less about them. I do know the tuitions are a lot higher. I am sure that you can get, under Danny Plotnick's good guidance, some great film education at University of San Francisco, but it is a private school. And so therefore the tuition is, you know, pretty high. Don't know what financial aid is like these days, but student debt is off the wall. There are art schools like California College of the Arts and Academy of Art College and all of those. I did not choose to apply my trade at any of those privates. I really like public education, and I think you can get a great film education in production or film studies through the public institutions like Cal State University. And if you're interested in documentary film and lucky enough to get into UC Berkeley, their journalism program is phenomenal. They produce amazing work, as of course does Stanford. The Stanford J School as well produces great documentary work. There are also some avant-garde and experimental film production classes taught at UC Berkeley. But as far as a production department and bang for your buck, I really am loyal to the Cal State University. And I'm somebody that wafted away to the East Coast and taught for Vassar for a while until I thought, you know, my heart is with the Cal State. Although I shared allegiances with UC Santa Cruz, where I taught on and off for about 4 years. And I thought their film production department was pretty darn great at UC Santa Cruz. So that's what I can say about film schools. But if Dan or Doug want to chime in, or anybody else with any experience, please do share.
I'll just chime in real quick. It's so nice to hear you, Karen. But on top of all that, this has been great. And I had to come and go with this home thing going on. But people who are looking into film schools is to visit. I mean, I think that's the key thing, is to visit and to put word out to whoever you can reach in those programs and ask to visit a production class. And if people are hesitant to allow you to visit a production class, I would keep looking. Here at Sac State, I open our doors for anyone who's interested, because in my opinion, you don't know what the fit is until you actually are sitting in the class.
Yeah.
And you know, if you get into you're witnessing and part of an active production class, you'll see how the thing works. You'll see how the ratio works. You'll see how the access to equipment is, what the tenor is, what the approach is. It won't be all encompassing because it's just one day, but that's, you know, you're going to be in the place for 4 years. You should just go hang out for a day. Can't stress that enough. And then on the CSU, I totally agree with Karen that you've got, if you want to be down south, you can be at CSU Long Beach. If you want to do animation, you can be at Long Beach, you can be at Northridge. There's a film program at Chico. It just all depends on what your needs are and taking the time to go check it out. So that's my 2 cents.
And speaking of professors, Joseph McBride, I've just put into the chat, our next lecture will be with Joseph McBride, who is a professor at San Francisco State University. And he's going to talk about how Westerns made me. So that's going to happen on Tuesday, November 16th at 6 p.m. We are out of time. So Katie, please promise you'll come back and talk to us more about movies.
Anytime. Thank you from the Opera and Diva and Go Alexander Film Society. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you all.
Thank you. And to all of you who joined us, thank you for coming, and please come back and see us sometime. You'll be seeing us as we reemerge together from COVID in the future. So stay safe out there. Happy pending holidays, and we'll see you all at the movies.
Oh, yeah, you can get my email address from Catherine, or I can post it in the chat if you like. Here it is, coming at you. It's K Davis, if you want to keep in touch, at CAFilm for California Film Institute.org.
And Katie, what about the lecture, the Osher Institute? Is there a link for that?
Let's see, csumb.edu. Ali, look for, I'm going to say, just type in Ali Monterey Bay for the Agnes Varda class for those interested. But happy to come back here and talk Varda anytime.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Well, bye.